I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we delve into the remarkable story of the Tuskegee Airmen through Dr. Patrick Coggins' amazing book. It is called Tuskegee Airmen World War II Fighter Pilots, the story of an original Tuskegee pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Hiram E. Mann. This powerful tribute honors the African-American pilots who defied prejudices and made history during World War II. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Writers Branding for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his remarkable book. The links are below this interview. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
You're welcome. Look forward to talking with you.
Well, I'm glad to have you on the show. Looking forward to our conversation as well. Tell us what made you decide to focus on the life of Lieutenant Colonel Mann.
There are basically four reasons. In 1995, I was a keynote speaker at the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Founders Day. And I saw these men in red jackets, and Colonel Mann was there. And afterwards, when I finished my talk, I said, "Why are you wearing these red jackets?" And he said, "I'm a Tuskegee Airman." I said, "How did you become a Tuskegee Airman?" And he said, "I was a fighter pilot during World War II." And I said, "How come? Very few people are not aware of your story." He says, "We're still in the process of trying to get it told." The second reason is that when I went to West Palm Beach and told the school district, I was a member of the school district there, that we need to invite the Tuskegee Airmen, very few individuals were aware of that. The only thing they can remember was in 1979, President Reagan did a documentary on the Tuskegee Airmen. They said, "I remember that movie," but they did not have any presence of how they look. So I was really impressed and decided to get permission from Palm Beach to invite these Tuskegee Airmen to come and give a 4-day lecture in the schools throughout southern Florida. And to my amazement, there were several World War II veterans who were there. And one caught my attention when we had the reception. He kept walking all around, and I said, "Sir, do you have a problem?" He says, "No, I'm just upset about something." I said, "You need to talk to me because I will have to have security to move you out of this session." He says, "No, no, no. I am crying because these Tuskegee Airmen saved my life." I said, "How did they save your life?" He said, "Many of them were assigned bombing duties to protect the bombers. We never knew who they were. All we saw was the red tail on their fuselage, and we knew they were red tails, but we never had a chance. The war ended, and we never had a chance to thank them. So I'm here tonight to really tell him and tell all the Tuskegee Airmen who were there about they saved my life, they protected me, etc." When I did further investigation, what he was saying was very valid because the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber that they escorted during World War II. And if you think about it, during World War II, before the Tuskegee Airmen was assigned to protect the bombers, we were losing about 6 to 5 bombers a day. On each bomber are 13 fathers, brothers, uncles, grandfathers, and the loss of the bomber and the loss of the 13 lives was extremely high to the US and to the Allied forces. And so they recommended that we assign, that they assign Tuskegee pilots because they noticed when they've protected the bombers, they were able to get back safely. So those were the driving reasons that pushed me into writing this book.
Well, those are compelling reasons for sure. So you met Lieutenant Colonel Mann. Did you interview him for this book to get his story?
Yeah.
Tell us
Yes.
about your conversations with him and how that research went.
I had a chance to spend 3 years with Colonel Mann and was at his final funeral. And met with him, met with his family, spent a lot of time, and because I wanted to validate one thing. When I looked at the research, none of the research had any original writings of a Tuskegee pilot. What I'm talking about a diary. So he said to me, I have a diary. You may not believe my stories. I said, if you have a diary, this will validate the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, because we see the records, the military records, we see how many sorties, how many planes, but nobody really talked about the human side. For me, the diary was the human side. When I went to his home and looked at all of his writings, it amazed me that he kept a record of his diary and all the incidences, and that is included in the book. And I think it's the only book, it's the only record of firsthand, day by day. Oh, I'm flying, a bomb fell off my plane. Oh, it hit the house. Those were the kinds of human stories that, and when I heard that, I said, Colonel Mann, you have to really share this. And would you trust me? I will protect it. And therefore, what's in the book is a compilation of I did not change anything. I just put it right in. He called it epistles. I call it diary.
Tell me a little bit, or tell the audience at home a little bit about who the Tuskegee Airmen were, how they were formed, and what their lives were like in the military service. Did they face prejudice like many African Americans did during that era? Or was it different in wartime because they had to have each other's back, whether you were white or black? Tell us, paint a picture for us there. Tell us about that aspect of the story.
To tell the story, we got to start with 1939. We were in the midst of Jim Crow, where separate was equal. And Congress passed a law recommending that we start this training program at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Tuskegee was picked because it was centrally located, and the Moulton Air Force was built there. Many of them were trained, I would say 900 pilots were trained right there at Tuskegee Air Base, and what 450 went to the World War II and actually participated actively. They were trained by themselves. And what was very significant, and Colonel Mann was very adamant about this, he said, for me to get into the training program, I had to have a bachelor's degree. For the white pilots, all they needed was a high school diploma. So he said, this is discrimination because we're both American citizens. We both have around the same age, and we should not have this discrimination. So they started with that disparity. They were trained separately. And it's not until 1941, and this is a very important year because Eleanor Roosevelt came to visit. She heard that they were trained since 1939. They were ready to fight in 1941, but they were just sitting there because of Jim Crow, because of the segregated military. As a result, she told her husband she's going to Tuskegee. She went to Tuskegee and she said, I would like one of these pilots, these Black pilots, to fly me. And the white commander says, no, I have to have a white pilot fly you. She says, no, if these guys are trained, if these men are trained, they need to fly me. So Colonel Anderson flew her. And of course, the press took pictures as she boarded the plane. And that same week, they ended up in Ramatali. They ended up in North Africa first. And in North Africa, they were segregated, and they had to fly from North Africa to Europe, to Italy, and to France, and to the central part where the war was going on. A couple of years later, they moved from there to Ramatali, and they were based there. But throughout their entire experience, they flew segregated. The question is, why were they so successful? Because they had what I consider excellent training. Secondly, because they were determined, because they had the Black press and they had individuals in the US saying, here is an opportunity. And the one thing they had to to deal with is in 1925, the Army hired a university in California to say that they did not have the ability to fly a complex airplane. There was something wrong with their brain. And of course, they had to prove that they were pretty good. And they did that.
Mm.
And all of the missions that they were assigned to were very successful. And I think the white pilots and the white power structure saw that they were efficient, and well-trained pilots. And throughout the war, until the war ended in 1946, they were in a segregated military. And it's not until 1948 that President Truman at that time passed a very important executive order that I think that everybody, whether you're in the military or non-military, just being a citizen, you really need to read that. Executive Order 9981 by President Truman says there will be no more segregation of the military. And what was frustrating and why this was important, because when they came back home, they could not get into the officers' clubs. There were captains, there were majors, that they were denied access into the officers' club. So they experienced discrimination before going into the military. While in the military, they fought separately, and then coming home, they still had to. So President Truman in 1948 really made a bold step and integrated the military. And why this is very significant, think about it, 1948, 6 years later, 1954, we had the Brown decision. And here is my opinion. I believe that if the military was not integrated in 1948, which is the biggest institution, then the integration of the United States, there would have been no Brown decision. Because remember, you had the Plessy versus Ferguson decision since 1896 until 1954, which says separate was equal. But I believe that their success and their determination and pushing the federal government and the president at that time to integrate laid the foundation. But there's a story that is very important. In 2010, I brought Colonel Mann to Stetson University here in DeLand. And one of the students asked him, why would you fight for a military, a segregated military during the war, and then when you come home, you get discriminated against? And he said something that really touched me. He said, this is my country. I was born here. The 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment made me a citizen. And I am fighting for my country because my country was at war. There was silence because these men, these Tuskegee Airmen, believed, as we are about to celebrate July the 4th, they believe in the flag, and they believed they were citizens, full citizens, and they believed that they had to fight. So I think that they set the bar very high for the civil rights movement that followed afterwards, because what they endured, they were called boy, they were called all kind of stuff, but their commander, Davis, always said, you're here to fly a plane. You can have distractions, but you're here to fight, because if you do not succeed, then there will be consequences, and that consequence is that there'll be a lot of disappointment, not just in the Black community, but in the white community, because people are expecting you to be successful.
Lieutenant Colonel Mann sounds like a true American hero. Of course he is, and very, very selfless, no doubt. I also think it's interesting that the Army was segregated up until 1948 and Truman's order. And then a decade or so later in Vietnam, African Americans were disproportionately represented in the war in that they were doing more fighting than white people were, white men. Yeah, so it went like an awful full circle in a way. Like you're segregated, you're different, you're not allowed to, okay, go fight our war, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that point, because one, when you look at the video of the Tuskegee Airmen, one of the white pilots said that I am a pilot. The Tuskegee Airmen are pilots, and we are the same. And I'm not going to fly to Berlin, which ended the war, unless the African American pilots, the Tuskegee Airmen, fly cover on the bombers.
Mm.
And the colonel said, well, why is that? They are experienced, they're competent pilots. They never lost a bomber that they escorted. Why wouldn't you allow me to actually be protected?
Mm.
And many of those white pilots who insisted, they won. The Air Force, the Army Air Force at that time, succumbed to their request that they wanted to have these pilots who they considered to be brothers, they considered to be kin, they considered to be equal fighters, to protect them. And that's how, in my opinion, as well as the Army record, we got to Berlin with very little resistance from the Germans, because we had some very efficient pilots, protecting those bombers that eventually dropped the bombs on Berlin, and the war began to wind down in a very productive way.
Exactly. Yeah. Race quickly melts away and doesn't matter when you're in a life and death situation. You don't care about the color of the skin of the person who's going to save your life.
Right.
Nobody cares about the color of the skin of the EMT or the firefighter who will climb into a burning building, or a police officer who will carry you out of that building. So wartime in some ways breaks down barriers, at least among the ranks themselves in many instances. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree with that. And there are two other instances that is very, very important. One instance, Colonel Mann was saying he protected a bomber that was hit and followed it back to the base once it's landed. And those pilots, they got him a bottle of rum, not rum, it's probably whiskey, but anyways, it was alcohol, to show their appreciation, because they know that normally when a bomber gets hit, the pilots may or may not, tag along with that bomber, because it puts not just the bomber a potential of loss, but also the pilots, because they're not concentrating on protecting the intervention of other pilots. The second incident was one that occurred here in the U.S. when we had the session at Stetson, and Colonel Mann came. There were 6 World War II pilots who came and embraced him and hugged him. And to me, that brought tears to my eyes, because that was the ultimate affirmation that we are brothers. We fought this war. We were protecting the flag. Yes, there were political issues, but we are now human beings in a different environment, and we should be shaking each other's hands, hugging each other, and uplifting each other.
Wonderful. Wonderfully got to witness that moment. I'm sure it was very, powerful and emotional to see, and to witness that part of history. Let's talk a little bit about the Red Tails. Were the Red Tails exclusively Tuskegee Airmen?
Yes.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that assignment.
And I really focused on this, and it's very interesting. There was a symbiotic relation. There's a group of heroes that nobody talks about. I talk a little bit about it, and that is the ground crew. The ground crew is very critical. For example, the P-51s did not have the gas capacity. The ground crew added a tank, which gave the pilots a little more distance, that they because they were flying from Ramitelli and way across Europe on missions. But the critical thing for me is that the ground crew got together with the pilots and decided, we want to make our planes unique. The Army, the Air Force, nobody said anything to them. They painted it red tails. Why? Because they wanted to be loud. They wanted it to be seen.
Yeah.
And in the end, it worked in our favor. By our, I mean the Allied, the US, etc. Because when the Germans saw the red tail, they were very careful to not mess around with those pilots because they know that those pilots were serious. They had something to prove, and they will take on the Germans, very aggressively, and was very successful. So the red tails became the mantra, became the identification, not just for the ground crew, for the pilots. And also, if you think about it, P-51s were being flown by white pilots and black pilots. So in order to figure out who is protecting you, that's the only thing that the white pilots can figure out. If it's red tail, they know these are the African-American pilots. If there's no red tail, then they know they were not. So it was basically a signature to inform their colleagues, to inform the enemies in terms of who is there. And that is why they became known as the red tails, because of the fuselage and the tail that had that red marking. And that was not an Army directive. That just came from the pilots and the ground crew. And what was also very interesting, if you look at Colonel Mann's plane, on the plane, he got the ground crew to put boss lady. The boss lady was his wife. Wow. There was that personal relationship that they had with the ground crew, and the Air Force, Army Air Force, allowed them to personalize the planes, and many of the pilots did that.
How long did Lieutenant Colonel Mann serve in the military, and what was his life like when he got back from his duty overseas?
His life was a mixed life, like for any other African American. Once you get out the uniform, he still had to deal with discrimination, but he got beyond that. He was able to join the Air Force and became became a major. He went from captain to lieutenant colonel to major, which is big. That's the progression. But he only received lieutenant colonel and major once he came and worked from 1948 until 1972 in the military. So he had a long journey in the military and made a difference. And one of the things that he did, which I think is very special, that people did not know, he was assigned to train Allied pilots from China, from Brazil, and that's documented in the book, those individuals. And that was he was so good in terms of a fighter pilot that he was assigned that duty. And he talked about it from Mexico. He was able to train those pilots and gave them the best skills that he had. And that is something that people did not realize, that part of our responsibility as a nation was not only to train our pilots, but also to train our allied pilots, because we had the planes, we had the means, we had the technology to do that.
Amazing. It's also amazing to me that many people confuse the Tuskegee experiment with the Tuskegee Airmen, and obviously two very disparate events in American history. Do you find that's common, that people hear Tuskegee and they think of the Tuskegee experiment or so forth?
That is a brilliant point. It is a point that brought tears in the eyes of all of the Tuskegee Airmen, because they said, this is not an experiment like the syphilis experiment. This is an experience. People call it an experiment. And why they call it an experiment is because of the 1925 California University study, which says that African Americans cannot fly airplanes. Their brains are not, does not have the capacity to withstand the G-force and all the other things required in flying a pilot. So they had, they were determined. They were determined to prove to the United States as well as people that they had the capacity to be successful. And one of the things that Colonel Mann always said we were never an experiment.
Mm.
Why? Because we were well trained. We were an experience. So many times he would use the word experience, the Tuskegee experience, and make sure that nobody call it an experiment. Because at that time, the key word was the syphilis experiment. He says nobody's is injecting anything into our bodies. All they're doing is injecting knowledge and skills and flying an airplane. And we are able to handle that because every single Tuskegee Airman had 2 years or more of college. So their brain had the capacity to absorb information. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were successful.
Like you said, had reached a higher level of education than their white counterparts, which is interesting as well. Are you working on any new books, Doctor?
Yes, the one that I'm working on is that people did not realize that when the Tuskegee Airmen came back when they came back in 1945, 1946, they tried to integrate the officers' quarters in Indiana.
Mhm.
It's called Freeman Air Force Base in Indiana in 1946. And to think about it, 1946, the war ended. 2 years later, 1948, 9981 executive order that integrated the military. So the military was not integrated. So between 1946, they were struggling as officers to be treated as officers. And they tried to go into all white officers club in Indiana, in Fremont Air Force Base, and they were arrested. But 200 of them were arrested. And as a result of their arrest, they run the risk of losing all their benefits, etc. Of course, they were uh, subsequently pardoned with the 1948 executive order, and Congress also pardoned them so that they were not, they did not. So I want to pursue this issue because there's a debate. There's a debate that it was Thurgood Marshall who brought the 1954 Brown decision that was responsible for freeing them and litigating their freedom. And the preliminary research showed that it was not Thurgood Marshall. And he was the macro person behind it, but he did not do the legal work. The legal work was done by another a lawyer in Indiana. So I really want, because here's my argument. My argument is that the Tuskegee Airmen used nonviolence to teach the civil rights movement that you can bring about change using nonviolence, using your brain, using persuasion, and they did that, and I really want to explore that. So that is my next project that I'm working on. What was the impact of that arrest, and how did that influence the civil rights movement? In my opinion, from the preliminary stuff, there would have been no 1954 Brown decision if they did not succeed with the 1981, 1948 integration of the military. So I think that, you know, when I look at Dr. Martin Luther King, he did his part, others did their part, but in the civil rights movement, but we only think of the Tuskegee Airmen in terms of flying planes.
Right.
I would like us to think of them in terms of being concerned about freedom and equality, not just in the military, but for everybody else. And I know I benefited from their efforts. And they are the ones who focus on nonviolence because they achieved it with not burning down any bases or doing anything. They achieved it by basically persuasion and arguing and getting their lawyers involved to make it.
Absolutely. In many ways, they laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement, and other people, other men, other women stood on their shoulders to get the job done, a job that is still being done and worked on today. The name of the book we've been focusing on today is written by Dr. Patrick Coggins. It is called Tuskegee Airmen World War II Fighter Pilots, a story of an original Tuskegee pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Hiram E. Mann. It is a powerful tribute that honors the African American pilots who defied prejudices and made history during World War II. You will learn about the incredible journey of Lieutenant Colonel Mann and the legacy of the Red Tails, who never lost an escorted bomber. It's an incredible story, and it is a true story. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Pleasure's been all mine, sir. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.